Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming. I thought I would start by asking really what literature is, because I think since this book is a novel, we should really go back to first principles. What is literature? I think that Ezra Pound said that literature is news that stays news, but I wonder if that's still true. Where news, it seems to me, still stays news. That something that was news 10 years ago is back as news. But that literature, every decade, fashions change. The books everyone's reading seem to change. If it had been 50 years ago, we would have been talking about Alexander Solzhenitsyn and the difference between Ivan Denisovich and the Gulag Archipelago. And that seems so long ago, and yet those books seem so fresh to me, but not to anyone who started reading a decade later, where a decade later in America, say, that people would have argued the difference between William Gaddis and John Updike, and there were arguments about should the novel be big and baggy and loose, or should it be small and delicate. Now, if the novel were going to be small and delicate, the novelist that everyone, when you go back to Ireland and people ask you, is there anything that Americans now agree on? Is there any matter on which there isn't a versus in the middle? It isn't a V word. And I said, yeah, that in the 1980s at some point, there was general agreement among people who read fiction that William Maxwell was a most interesting and delicate writer. And he wrote novels, really novellas, like They Came Like Swallows or So Long, See You Tomorrow. And there was a general agreement that they were delicate, that instead of tragedy, they were sad. They dealt with disappointment. They dealt with the sort of luminous matter of disappointment, that his characters could, the whole idea was not to even create character or to work with plot as much as to lift the rhythm into a space, almost like chamber music, 4 instruments could lift, to provide a sort of melody that was delicate and yet contained a great deal of powerful mystery. And I really, even as that idea went out of fashion, I thought no one had ever disagreed on this, where there were people who thought there was something about John Updike you could argue about, something with William Gaddis you could argue, John Cheever, Philip Roth, Joan Didion, that everyone could argue about these books, but no one could ever do that about William Maxwell. Well, imagine my surprise when a book came out called Moral Agents by Edward Mendelsohn. And his office at Columbia is 2 doors down from mine. And so I see him on the corridor. And when his book came out, I thought I should read it. And there's an essay on William Maxwell. And I was delighted because I love when something that I hold sacred, someone else begins to demolish slowly and sort of forensically, so that I really can't argue back. I can just feel sort of hurt and unhappy until I move over to the other side and agree that you were right all along, and how could I have thought what I still think? But this is the small matter in the novel of plot. What is plot? When do we need it? What does it mean? How do you do it? And this is Edward Mendelsohn. Remember, I didn't write this. And although I like his tone and I want to copy it, but here he goes on the subject of William Maxwell. All of Maxwell's novels have a story, but no plot. A plot. Now, this is lovely. This is the professor that I want to be trying to explain something to students very carefully and slowly. A plot, what is a plot? A plot is the means by which fiction portrays the consequences of actions. But it is not like a pool table. One event never mechanically causes another. In a plot, each event provokes other events by making it possible for them to happen. Each event provokes other events by making it possible for them to happen. Possible but not inevitable, because human beings are always free to choose their response to provocation. Maxwell succumbed to an error common among writers who organize their work for the finest possible rhythms and textures. The error of thinking of plot as mechanical and therefore trivial. As Maxwell explained to John Updike, plot, schmott. So the problem then is, if you wanted to put a plot in a novel, it wouldn't just be an action. You couldn't just have something happening. It would have to be about the consequences of that thing, or how that thing allowed the other things to occur. And I was trying to find examples of this, thinking about Thomas Hardy's novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge. And in that novel, in the opening chapter of that novel, I think there is action that requires consequences. And the consequences will be unpredictable. Some of them may be inevitable, but probably not. And so it is where there's a country fair, things are for auction, people are selling animals, people are selling property, and there's a podium from where you can sell things. And a man stands up at the podium and says, "My wife, I want to sell her. Who will buy my wife?" And so that, I suppose, is the action. What we want now to see from that moment, obviously it will have to have consequences. Somebody will have to do something, even if the consequences are going to be disappointing ones. For example, that nobody buys her. And the story becomes, that the story becomes that evening. What is the man, how are the man and his wife now going to deal with one another when night falls, or when the light begins to dwindle? What will they say? What will it be like? And that's one way of dealing with it, where you bring the story down into silence, disappointment, a sort of taciturn, something almost being said between the two of them that might redeem them in some way, but probably doesn't, probably leaves things open at the end. And so, but instead, Thomas Hardy has a man over to the right, and he bids, he says, "I will buy her." And he's a silent stranger, or he was silent up to then, and he is handsome, and he's mysterious, and he's from outside the town, and he takes her away. Now, that, by any standards, is something that's going to require consequences. We're going to need to know at some point what happened to those three people: the man who sold his wife, the man who bought, and the woman in the middle. And even though the novel will go for 100 and more pages without mentioning this again, you realize it's always going to not reoccur, but it's basically underneath, it's undercurrent all the time. Even more when it's not mentioned, you realize that something is going to result from it. And the novel, in fact, is going to be the story of that. So with that in my mind, I want to read the opening few pages of this novel, which is called Long Island. And what happened is that I wrote a novel called Brooklyn 15 years ago. I published it 15 years ago. And it is the story of an Irish woman called Eilish Lacey who goes to America. And she's young, and it's the 1950s, and she meets a man. And but she goes home to Ireland as well, and she meets another guy who's called Jim. And he owns a pub, or he will come into possession of a pub in the town of Enniscorthy, where I'm from and where Eilish is from, in the southeast of Ireland. And so she hasn't seen him. This is now 25 years later. And she has settled with her husband, Tony, who was the American guy, and his family. In other words, there are 4 houses in a sort of cul-de-sac in Lindenhurst on Long Island. And she lives in one with her husband and their 2 children, who are called Larry and Rosella. In the next house, her mother-in-law and her father-in-law live. And in the 3rd house, her brother-in-law, and in the 4th house, her other brother-in-law and their families. So they're in this enclave on Long Island. And so all we need to know for the opening is that I have been reading about plot and thinking about plot, and I've decided I'm fed up, really trying to write these openings that are so opaque and so filled with little details, and you're trying to set up a landscape or trying to describe someone. And the reader is constantly wondering, but what are they going to have to do with the overall story? Am I wasting my time reading all about 2 people who will never be mentioned again, or are minor characters in this story? And I thought that plot, in a way, has been stolen by writers about detectives and writers about catastrophe. That's what a plot has to be. It has to be someone got murdered and we can see them on the ground. And then the consequences of that are going to... But I thought, I can't really do murder. I don't know. It's just not... I don't know what it is. It's something in me. And I'm not any good, really, at catastrophe. So I thought that... this is the opening of the book. That Irishman has been here again. Her mother-in-law said, sitting down at the kitchen table, "He's come to every house, but it's you he's looking for. I told him you would be home soon." "Oh, what does he want?" Eilish asked. This is Eilish, mid-40s now. She's 25 years since Brooklyn. "I did everything to make him tell me," her mother-in-law said, "but he wouldn't. He asked for you by name." "He knows my name." Her mother-in-law's smile had an insinuating edge. Ailish appreciated her mother-in-law's intelligence and also her sly sense of humour. Another man is the last thing I need, Ailish said. I know who you'd talk. Mother-in-law replied. They both laughed as her mother-in-law stood up to go. From the window, Ailish watched her walk carefully across the damp grass to her own house. Soon Larry, her son, would be in from school, and then Rosella from after-school study, and then she would hear Tony, her husband, parking his car outside. This would be a perfect time for a cigarette. You have to remember this is 1976, so you can say that, you can write that sentence. This would be a perfect time for a cigarette. But having found Larry smoking, she had made a bargain with him that she would give up completely if he promised not to smoke again. She still had a packet upstairs. When the doorbell rang, Ailish stood up lazily, presuming that it was one of Larry's cousins calling for him. However, from the hallway, she made out the silhouette of a grown man through the frosted glass of the door. Until he called out her name, it did not occur to her that this was the man Francesca had mentioned. She opened the door. Are you Ailish? The accent was Irish. Also, the way the man stood there as though waiting to be challenged reminded her of home. I am, she said. I've been looking for you. His tone was almost aggressive. She wondered if Tony's business could owe him money. So I hear. You're the wife of the plumber. Since the question sounded rude, she saw no reason to reply. He's good at his job, your husband. I'll say that. He's in great demand. The man stopped for a second, looking behind to check no one was listening. He fixed everything in our house. He went on, pointing a finger at her. He even did a bit more than was in the estimate. Indeed, he came back regularly when he knew that the woman of the house would be there and I would not. And his plumbing is so good that she's to have a baby in August. He stood back and smiled broadly at her expression of disbelief. That's right. That's why I'm here. And I can tell you for a fact that I'm not the father. It had nothing to do with me, but I am married to the woman who is having this baby, and if anyone thinks I'm keeping an Italian plumber's brat in my house and have my own children believe that it came into the world as decently as they did, they can have another think. He pointed a finger at her again. So as soon as this little bastard is born, I am transporting it here. And if you are not at home, then I will hand it to that other woman, and if there's no one at all in this house as you people own, I'll leave it right here on your doorstep. He walked towards her and lowered his voice. And you can tell your husband from me that if I ever see his face anywhere, I'll come after him with an iron bar that I keep handy. Now have I made myself clear? Ailish wanted to ask him what part of Ireland he was from, as a way of ignoring what he had said, but he had already turned away. She tried to think of something else that might engage him. Have I made myself clear? He asked again as he reached his car. When she did not reply, he made as though to approach the house once more. I'll be seeing you in August, or it could be late July, and that's the last time I'll see you, Ailish. How do you know my name? She asked. That husband of yours is a great talker. That's how I know your name. He told my wife all about you. Now, the problem arises when you write that is, what can you do now? In other words, like he's gone, she's there, she's got an hour on her own in the house, it's about April. So what do you do? In other words, should she run straight over to her mother-in-law? Should they either have a big fight with each other, her mother-in-law saying Tony would never do anything like that, or would they join forces and wait for Tony when Tony would come home from work and be standing ready to do what? Scream at him? So I can't do screaming, really. And the reason why this man is Irish is that I could not write that in an American tone. That there's something about the two languages. I mean, it's the same language, but there's a different way an American might speak, and I don't know what it is. So I could try it, I could show it to people, but there would be something wrong with it always. It could just be a word that someone would never use, that I think they would use and would creep in there and remain there, and everyone in the audience would say, your book was great, but I thought that word or phrase or using a particular term. I had this problem before I mean, a very extreme way, maybe, with the novel Brooklyn, where I decided the best way for her to get to know Tony, who she was, having a romance with, was to just watch him, go around with him. So she went to a baseball game with him. She's Irish, she'd never been to a baseball game before. And she went with him and his brothers. And so I did that. I went to just one baseball game just to see, if you're an outsider, what this sport looked like. I have to say, I thought it was slow, but that's another matter. And so I just wrote as I was writing the novel, I wrote a scene in which she does this, and it's described. And the editor in America called me up and said, got a problem a bit with, you need to make changes in this baseball thing. And I said, all right. And she said, what? And she said, well, I'm going to read you out the sentence. At half-time, they went and had a hot dog. So I said, well, do you mean that hot dogs have to be there in the 50s? And we did go and get a hot dog when I was there. So do you mean that there's something wrong? You're like, what would it be? Did they go and have a burger? No, not a burger, a hot dog. And she had nothing to do with a hot dog. I said, well, what? And she said, there's no half-time in baseball. I said, there is, because we went and got a hot dog at half-time. She said, no, stop. The word mansplaining at that time it was not a word. But if that had been a word, she probably would have said, stop telling me about baseball. Listen to me, for God's sake. And she told me it was called the 7th inning stretch. And I said, I can't say that, and I can't spell it, and I can't write it. The 7th what? And in any case, luckily, the book had not been printed. If it had been printed, it would have been a disaster, because it wasn't in her dialogue. It was the author describing, at halftime, they went and had a hot dog. And so, you've got to be very, very careful. There's something else in this where, this thing I'm going to read in a minute, where they have the phrase, oh, she did a line with him. And in Ireland, that means she had a romance with him, to do a line with someone. And, I mean, and the problem is, what do you do with that? And I thought, just leave it. The context will make it clear, but also, you can't put a footnote at the bottom. And don't change, it's what someone would say, so don't change it. But nonetheless, you've got to watch this business of, since she's crossing the Atlantic, trying to navigate, trying to work out how to deal with the world as an Irish woman in America. In a way, I'm sort of following her in that respect. So what happens then is that she doesn't know what to do in the next hour, and because I don't know what to do. So does she cry? No, she doesn't cry. She's trying to work out if what she heard could be true. And it's important that he's Irish, because since he's Irish, she can read him. She can sense that sort of man, speaking like that, who's Irish, will never say something he doesn't mean. In that state he's in, what he's saying is true. So that much matters, that he's Irish and she's Irish, and they can sort of read each other. Or at least she can read him. The problem is, will I have her go upstairs? But what will she do upstairs? The main thing is she's not going to smoke, because that would be too easy, just to say, you've signaled the cigarettes already, have her go upstairs, get a cigarette, and sort of puff away for an hour. That's not what I'm looking for here. And obviously she can go to the phone, but who would she phone? Her sister, that she would normally have thought about like that, is dead. Her mother is in Ireland. Her mother's going to be 80 soon, but her mother has no telephone. So the only thing I can think of doing is that she goes, and I've never done this, and I've never seen anyone do it, is she goes to the telephone, she lifts the receiver, and she just listens, as though there's someone on the other side. And in other words, the sort of pressure on her, the strain, the stress, just causes this to be necessary. But the reason that she does it is that I can't think of anything else for her to do that will be silent, will be solitary, will be, strange. And that's what she does. But what she does later is she decides that she will go back for a stay in Ireland. She will go first, and her kids will come later. It's the summer is coming. It's important it's the summer, because if it was the winter, you can't really have a novel. If you have an Irish novel in the winter, it's a very different sort of book than this, where you just have long, long nights, short days, recrimination, people shouting at you, turn off that light, you're wasting electricity, and that sort of novel. And so I needed one good day on a beach. And you obviously can't get that in, you can't even get that in August, actually, but maybe July. And So when she goes back to Ireland, obviously the problem is that there's a man called Jim Farrell that she ditched 25 years before. She came back to Ireland and she had a romance with him. She did a line with him, as they say. And she ditched him. I mean, she simply went back to Brooklyn, went back to America, leaving him a note to say she was leaving. And he's never seen her since, and she's never seen him since. And so here she is. She's in her mid-40s. She's back in the town. She's having a real problem with her mother. In other words, she's back sleeping in her old bed, in her old bedroom, and her mother hasn't touched the house in 25 years. You know, the kitchen is still. Her mother has no fridge. Everything is in need of repair. But it's not just that. Her mother is in a rage with her over being away so long. And instead of being friendly and sweet and welcoming, her mother has become quite aggressive and strange. This changes as the book goes on. But in these first days, she's not where she thought she would be. And she wishes she had come a bit later. But one night, anyway, her mother says something particularly outrageous about America. And she just decides that she's going to go for a walk. And it's 10 o'clock at night, and she goes for a walk. And the town is empty. It's the town of Enniscorthy. Anyway, as she wondered about how she might set about persuading her mother to come for a drive with her someday, she saw a figure standing at the door of Jim Farrell's pub. Instantly, she realized that it was Jim himself. She did not know if he had seen her. He was looking in the other direction. But he might have averted his gaze precisely because he had spotted her coming towards him on the opposite footpath. Even though she put her head down, she was sure that he would not be able to avoid noticing her. There was no one else on the street. If she were to turn her head and glance across, their eyes would connect. She would not know what to do, and she could not imagine how he might respond. Maybe he had not actually recognized her, but if he had seen her, they could hardly just nod to each other or say a polite hello. The best thing would be for her not to look across at him again and to proceed without glancing behind. An encounter like this was always bound to happen. She'd never imagined, however, that if she were to see him, she would actually feel an urge, as she did now, to approach him, speak to him, hear his voice. But it could not be done. She would have to continue on her walk through the town as if he were not standing watching her from the door of the pub. And if this were another sort of book, I could end the book there, you know, that she comes back to Ireland after all the years, she sees him once like that. And in that sort of mild disappointment, she realizes that she really can't talk to him, and she walks on. But the problem I've made for myself is that with that opening, no matter what happens, more has to happen. The consequences of that are like bigger waves than you might normally get in a novel. But to still go back to the idea that the less that happens in a novel, sometimes the more you can get. But nonetheless, this first encounter is a signal that there are going to be other encounters between Eilish and Jim, that they really have to meet again at least once, and that maybe this, rather than the opening of the novel, maybe this is the story of the novel, the story that this allows her, that opening scene allows her to come home, allows her to come home alone, and allows her to come home where something in her, some set of emotions has loosened or become more interesting and more complex. So we move to Jim's perspective. He's in his mid-40s, he's still not married, he's living over his pub. It's very hard for someone who owns a pub in a small town in Ireland to, for example, if you're in your 20s and everyone else is going to a dance on Saturday nights, you can't go because you have to look after the pub. It's the same on Friday night, it's the same on Sunday night. You're probably free on Tuesday night when there's nothing on anywhere, there's not even bingo on, you know. And but he was let down badly, let down being meaning that he was dumped very badly by Eilish, and he was then dumped by some other woman, and he's just not, he's not confident, and so he, but what he is what I was trying to work with was an idea of an Irish character who was solid, stable, tactful, decent, and quiet. And if you just scroll down all your Irish characters, this is not what men in Ireland normally are depicted as. You know, it's an actor's paradise, this, where you can always have men shouting. And I mean, that opening scene, you know, an Irish man comes, what does he do? He shouts. And but what if he didn't shout? And what if everything Jim feels that he internalizes? What if he's introspective? What if he's mainly quiet? What if he has a sort of strange authority in the bar, but it arises from his sort of distance from things? He doesn't say much. His father told him, as a barman, as a bartender, as a bar owner, if you're ever inclined to say something, don't. If you're ever inclined to, just tell anyone a bit of news that you've heard, don't. And he thought this was very good advice, and this is what he mainly does. He serves people drinks, he listens, he knows everything, he watches. And he's a very good employer. I mean, there are two barmen working for him, and they seem to have a good relationship. And so for him, seeing her after 25 years outside on the street has really stayed in his mind. Like, how is he going to see her? How are they ever going to meet? Her brother comes into the bar, he's called Martin, and he says, sister, he's having an awful time with the mother. They're like cats, the two of them. And it's in such a state that the sister has gone down to a shack that Martin, her brother, owns on the cliff overlooking the Irish Sea in County Wexford in the southeast of Ireland. Jim listens, and in a way he's the least impulsive of people, but he realises when the brother leaves the pub and he's on his own sitting there in the afternoon that he should just drive down. It's 10 miles away. See if he could find her. He doesn't know what he'd say or do, but he wants just to see her almost. And he drives down, and he sees her car, which he's noticed already. It's a rented car. And then he sees the shack or the little house, but there's no one in the house. So he decides to walk down to the Strand, which is, another word for the beach. And when he saw her walking towards him on the Strand, he realised she would be alarmed at the sight of him no matter what. He was an intruder on her solitude, but she had seen him. He could not turn. She was wearing a blue dress and had a towel under her arm. As he was trying to work out what to say, a wave came rushing in towards him, and he had to dart quickly away from it. He felt for a moment a sense of pure disbelief that this was happening. He looked down at the sand, and when he lifted his head, she was there. Expression on her face, not angry or fearful, but puzzled, almost amused. How did you know I was here? Martin, the brother, was in the bar. He told me. And you drove down. I saw you on the street a while ago, and I worried that we might never get a chance. How are you? She asked. Good. I'm glad to see you. Will you walk back with me? She asked. If anyone were to meet them now, he thought they might be a local couple taking a walk. But when he stole a glance at her, he saw that this could not be true. She did not look like a local woman. Her dress could not have been bought in Ireland, and the natural way her hair was cut set her apart, as did the smoothness of her skin. But more than anything, it was the ease and confidence she had. Her face was thinner. You could see some wrinkles at the corners of her mouth, but her eyes were bright and alert, and her gaze was focused as she turned to him and spoke decisively. I'm told you're doing a strong line with a woman in Dublin, she said. Who told you that? Everyone knows it, except me. Is that why you're blushing? He could think of nothing to say in reply. He wasn't sure that if she really had heard such a thing, or if she'd made it up in order to break the silence. And you? He asked. I'm a married woman, a mother. How long are you staying? 4 or 5 weeks more. My children are coming at the beginning of August. He noticed that she did not say her husband was coming too, and was glad. He would not relish seeing Ailish with her American husband in the streets of the town. How is your mother? Well, she's well. He wanted to ask her the reason she was here alone, but every question he thought of seemed wrong. It occurred to him that he really wanted to ask if she had thought about him much over the years, and if she'd ever regretted not staying with him. Do you like it down here? He asked. It's so calm, she said, so empty. When they came to the steps that led to the cliff, she found her sandals. He helped her climb the loose sand to the first step. As he took her hand, he thought this might have been what he came down here for, to touch her once, to have her smile as she leaned on him, and then to walk slowly behind her up to the edge of the cliff. In the lane, he saw what she was doing. She was somehow making this encounter natural, uncomplicated. He would get no chance to ask her anything. As the early evening sunlight caught her face, her smile was a mask, but there was no strain in her voice. "Your accent hasn't changed much," he said. "Sometimes I try to sound more American, but the kids say I just sound even more Irish. Have they been in Ireland before? Never. Nor you, since you left." "This," she said, "is my first time since then." Neither of them, he knew, would have any trouble remembering what then meant. He wished he'd been with her all the years, but there was nothing could be done about it now. For a second, it struck him that since this was probably the last time he would see her, he should say something. But then he thought it would be best to leave it. There was nothing to say. Nothing that was easy or simple, nothing that he could find words for now. "You look so sad," she said. "I feel sad seeing you." "Don't be sad about that. That was the way it had to be. And do you ever, I don't know," he said, do you ever think about me?" As soon as he had said it, he knew how wrong it sounded. It was as if he was looking for pity or needing her to say something comforting to him. He watched her thinking. She had decided, he saw, not to respond. When he had known her, she was softer. She would have made it easier for him. Now, as they stood by her car, it was clear that she wanted him to go. She put out her hand. That was as much as she would do. She did not want to embrace him. He would say nothing more to embarrass her or himself. I hope I didn't surprise you too much," he said. "Not at all," she replied. "I thought we should see each other, and it would be hard to do that in the town." When she did not answer, he reached out and shook her hand. He walked up the lane to his car. He stood and inspected the horizon before taking out his keys and opening the car and turning it so that he could go back to Enniscorthy. Thank you.
Did you want the ending to be something else, or did you feel that this was just what had to be?
One of the problems about writing after that opening is that you've set up an idea that no matter what happens in this book, something has to happen. And that every action will almost be a result of one, will reflect one, and all the things I'm used to doing in novels, which is straying off into having someone go for a walk or remember something from the past or just constantly creating atmospheres. I can't do that anymore. So that what I'm doing with the book, I delivered the book in January of last year, and I had a year with it then, just where it was finished, but I could take it out every so often and read it, realizing that anything that didn't lead to something had to go naturally, as though you'd read it and think, what's that ever been doing here? And so cutting sentences, paragraphs, bring it down to its bones to say, this is a story. Get on with the story and stop, going into, I suppose, stop the sidetracks. But the ending of the book was always the goal, in a way. That it wasn't as though I was going to discover an ending. I was going to have the ending as a goal, and my work every day was to find a way to move towards that goal with as much, I suppose, trying to get as much complexity into everyone's motive as I could, because really there was so much bare action. So therefore, I really didn't have many choices, just simply because I have now, you see, the first section is Eilish's point of view. She's in America. It's what happens to her from her side. The problem now is that I need the reader to know things that she doesn't know. And how do I do that? Because there's nothing worse than the author coming in to say, what she didn't realize as she stepped off the train was that there was a, and if you do that, as the author, people really begin to resent you, saying, could you know all stuff? Just give us the character and stand back. So therefore, I worked out that I had a character from way back, from the summer of 2001, of a woman called Nancy Sheridan, who had been Eilish's best friend in Brooklyn, But the story about her, it was written before Brooklyn. It was written, Brooklyn was written in, 2006 or 2007. But it's a story called The Name of the Game in a book called Mothers and Sons. And it's about this woman called Nancy whose husband dies, who opens what's called a fish and chip shop in Enniscorthy, meaning she will serve fries to people coming from the pub who just want some soakage for all the alcohol they've been consuming, all the pints of beer and stuff, that they will make a big line to buy fish and chips, hamburgers, and fried onions. Fried onions. And so it's just a story about a woman doing that. So I had her in my mind all the time. She's been there in a way that if you spend a summer just putting so much motive and detail into how she built the chip shop, how she didn't get planning permission, how she forced then the local council to give her the permission, the smell, the odors from the oil, the boiling oil, and how the customers came and how her children handled this. So I had all that for 20 years. I'd written it, I'd published it, but it was somehow still not fresh in my mind, but embedded. So I had her. So I thought, right, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the rest of the novel from 3 points of view. Now, it's a most dangerous thing, 3 points of view, because if you lose one of them, the reader goes, I don't know where I am and who is this and where it is. I was just getting used to Ailish or Jim. Now this Nancy is coming in. So what you have to do is then start the next section with Nancy and give such detail over her chip shop, over the fact that the oil has gone on fire or their odors. Like there's a crisis immediately in the first moment because you have to get her in real time as though there's something exact occurring. And then you can have, I'm not giving the plot away, but I mean, this is just it's not very far into the novel, a knock on the door or the bell rings and she goes down and who has come back from America? But Ailish Lacey, who you've already seen in the book. So I was trying to work with all that, integrating, getting these 3 characters to meet each other and see each other. And so that was the idea, really, to see if the whole question of who knows what could be integrated. And the question of everyone, I think, I often, is this a common experience where when you're 20, 21, you go home to where your parents are, your grandparents are, and there's something, no matter what it is, that you don't tell them. It could be that you're studying so hard that you haven't been at a protest. And they're big lefties, and they think you've been at all the protests. And you can't confess to them, no, I care about my exams much more than I care about the protest. In other words, no matter what it is, it could be unpredictable. But I remember just coming back. I remember coming back from Dublin once, and my mother said, "You look so tired. Are you all right? Have you got the flu?" I just had a hangover. But how could you say, look, I was out most of the night? Because you get so worried. Are you drinking? I'm drinking. And so, in other words, that idea of that you learn very early in your life, there are things you mustn't tell people. So you get told at home, don't tell anyone that. And so that business of reticence, becoming silence, becoming secrecy, that actually is something you can really work with in a novel because the reader can know everything. And then you can watch what character knows what. And you can also watch characters saying something that's different than what they think. And it's very hard to think of what other art form allows that. I mean, in drama, it's very hard to do, but you can put it in a novel. He wondered if he should tell her something. And then you see the next line is, how's your mother? Or do you like it down here? I mean, you can see all those lines of dialogue are just there are distracting, are ways of not saying what he most wants to say. But then, of course, what he does want to say, it's unsayable. Why did you leave me? And so you start working with all that. And the end, I know the end all the time. It's sad.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to hear you speak about Ailish and Brooklyn and this novel, which I have not read yet, so I don't know about the ending. But I come from an Irish-Italian family, and that's a big combination in the New York area. I don't know if it's so much here in Philadelphia, but so I related very deeply to Brooklyn and the book and then the movie as well. I related to the Irish part of it, and especially the talking about the sort of repressed nature of some of the women back in Ireland that she realized, oh, now I remember what you're like, and how she had to come back to America and so forth. And there was also a similar situation in my family growing up, 15 years into my parents' marriage. So this is all very resonant for me. But I just wanted to know if you could speak about this. Why did you choose an Irish and Italian couple to build on, and then an Italian family that you put this Irish woman into that she then had to leave?
I did some research. I didn't do much, but I bought a book called An Oral History of Brooklyn in the 50s. It was pretty good stuff because they just went around. You know, we get a topic like the beach or shopping or the bars, or it wouldn't be the bars so much as, you know, and yeah, maybe the bars, but each time they would just let someone talk and edit it. And one guy said, he was Italian, and he said, all the Italian guys of my age, all we wanted was an Irish girlfriend. And I read that and thought, no one in Ireland knew that at the time. You know, because if that had been known in Ireland, if people in Ireland had, if it had been just mentioned in the radio or something, I think there would have been an exodus, you know. And so then I thought about it and realized that, of course, after the Second World War, one of the projects might have been to become more American, you know, and not to be, you know, Italian American, but so that if you wanted an Irish girlfriend, she would be English speaking, she would be she would be Catholic, and she would be white, and therefore she would, you know, tick those boxes, and then she would also not be Italian. So the next generation could have not Italian names, could not, you know, feel they were really from Naples all along, and so that's who she meets. And but also I didn't want him to be Irish, because if he was Irish and if she'd met him at an Irish dance in Brooklyn, then I could predict almost what would happen. With the Italian, the problem she has is simple. That in Ireland, if someone is charming and smiling all the time and forever, just, you know, especially a young man, just smiling and being nice and charming, no one would trust you. People would just think, there's something wrong with that fellow. You want to watch that fellow. You know, in other words, get him drunk or get him on a football match or something, and you see something else. It's a mask. It's a way of disguising something real. And so she has a real problem with Tony because he seems to be smiling all the time. He's completely charming. She can't read him. And watching her, that's a drama for me, just watching her, watching him, like keep studying him. And of course, when she goes to see his family, she realizes that they really live in 2 rooms. In Ireland, that would be really a serious matter because it would be a class issue of how many rooms do you have. But these people seem so confident and so charming, and the food, you know, like the whole idea of tasting Italian. In the movie, they do a whole thing with spaghetti, which isn't in the novel, but it is about tasting garlic and tomato and all that stuff mixed up. But since he's Italian, then she's isolated eventually because, of course, she doesn't really make any friends of her own then. She moves into his world. And, yeah, I could work a comedy in a way about, you know, Irish person watching Italians and try and be careful not to overdo the, you know, not to make them, no mafia stuff. I wasn't going near it. I mean, that's just rubbish. I mean, to try and make, they were all mafia. They turned out to be mafia. Well, that would be just awful stuff. But all they turned out, you know, like, there's so many things you could do with the cliches of an Irish person. Just make Tony really charming and really nice, and see where that would take you. And so that's how it happened. Thank you.
I was thinking about your thoughts about who knows what, and I'm thinking about the small town of Enniscorthy and how the things that happen get reflected from all the people that live in the town. My mother was from a small town in Ireland as well. We went to visit after 28 years she'd been here. And she said, oh, we have to go down the back way. I said, why? She said, everyone is watching you. So maybe you would like to say a few words about who knows what and how that gets reflected. Thank you. Yeah.
You see, I think in particular, everyone is watching a returned Yank. If you're home from America, people presume that you're rich. Or if you're not rich, then how come? And in what way, and also, have you got an American accent? This business of the American accent became, I met a woman and they'd been in America for a long time and they'd made a lot of money, and I just said to her, oh, I was with your husband, and someone said, he's the man with the American accent, and she said, well, now, I'd like to let you know that he had the American accent ever before we went to America. Because somebody would decide it was a new way of being grand, or, you start talking like somebody in the movies. And so America became, they would really talk about the phrase an empty letter meant a letter from America with no money in it. And there's an extraordinary figure. It's very hard to be sure how much money was sent back, but enormous amounts of money were sent back, especially to the west of Ireland, from people working sometimes in menial jobs in New York. We just get some dollars and send them back. And there was a woman next door to us, Mrs. Hennessy, and she had two sisters, Auntie Betty and another aunt, and they were her sisters, and they both came back every summer, maybe for a month, 1 or 2 weeks, one from England, and she seemed sort of beaten down, the woman from England, while the woman from America was really, no matter what you said, she'd say, oh no, in the States we don't. We have an ice box up here, but below we have a freezer. Freezers hadn't started in Ireland at that time. But my mother said, oh, she's marvelous. She's a housekeeper for a family in Connecticut, and they're fabulously wealthy. So all this sense of fabulous wealth. And so that Eilish has a rented car, and she keeps it. In other words, she's paid some money, and whatever has happened, she has enough money to cover it. No one in Enniscorthy in 1976 would get what was called a self-drive for longer than a day. The idea of having it outside your door, wasting it, when you should be driving to Kerry or to Donegal. So everyone's watching her now because that's the daughter back from America with the car outside her door, rented car. Must be eating money, that car, And so all of that stuff about, you certainly would watch someone home from America. And Eilish is not really conscious of that. But the minute she arrives at Nancy, stayed at home, Nancy notices everything about her and sees it as an example of America. And so that's, I think that the noticing of outsiders is particularly strong. And especially in that returned Yank business.
Are you working out something emotionally, on your own, spiritually? Because it seems as though in these two books, there were some very painful scenes about missing home and missing family. So I'm wondering what that does to you when you're done with the novel. Have you grown or worked something out?
Yeah, I had the story of Brooklyn in a novel called Nora Webster that I wrote some of before I began Brooklyn. And it's 4 sentences, I think, on about page 5. And it is just a story of it was really our house. And after my father died when I was 12, in that summer, people would just come to visit. And they would say something very consoling to my mother, and then they would just talk. And one evening, someone told a story that was like some of the story of Brooklyn. And I just put it in, the details of that, just to show in that house what sort of things people were talking about. And then I went to Texas. And I spent a semester at the University of Texas in Austin. And I grew homesick. And I'm probably 50 years old. And it's a very privileged position. And in the morning, I wanted to be home. And I knew what home was. And home was Ireland. Home was turning on the radio and hearing Irish news, which in Ireland I would turn off after, rage about some, and Irish food. But not just that, an atmosphere, a sense of, first of all, you guys drive on the wrong side of the road, which, might sound funny until you go out in the morning and you're not quite sure which side, for a second, because if there's no other cars on the road. But anyway, I wanted to go home, but I stayed out. Obviously I stayed for the semester, and the minute I went home, I said I'd go back to work. And I read that first chapter I'd written of Nora Webster with a view to continuing the book, with a view to finishing it. And on page 5, I saw these 4 sentences. Whatever was in them, I saw that there was a story in them. But it wasn't just a story, it was something that now mattered to me enormously. What did that mean? To go and come back. And that whole idea of missing home, of losing home, of being in between two homes, of how would I dramatize that? Because I saw in this story an arc, meaning that she went to America, that she came back. And so those two journeys, what it's like in the first weeks and what it's like to come home. And so I set about writing that. And also, anyone who's ever been in America or Australia, if you're Irish, the big problem is the phone call that comes saying there's a problem at home. And you have to get out to the airport and you suddenly realize that, traveling through the night across the Atlantic, because it's going to be the other side, that someone is sick or there's been a big problem at home. And so you're suddenly always, it's not true that you're always worried about it, but when the worry comes, it's very sharp. And you slowly get used to wherever you're living anyway. So I started to work on this in the novel. I thought it could be a short story. It got longer. And I was using also, my mother had two younger sisters, and they didn't go to America, but the younger one, could easily have gone to America. And in a way, her sister was more powerful. She was the less powerful one. And I was partly using that idea of someone from my family, and there are details in the book that someone from the family would recognize, such as the real place they worked, and if you worked in that office, you automatically member of a small golf club, and all those things are from the world I knew. And so, all of it began to matter. So it wasn't like inventing a character, it was working out something dramatically that I felt was more and more happening to me, of losing a place, getting a place, it never being right, in-betweenness, and sudden darting feelings of homesickness, sudden darting feelings of absolute carelessness, or not caring. It didn't matter sometimes, that it did. You couldn't control it, but it wasn't out of control. It was merely something that wavered, and I thought I could work with that if I wrote a novel about it. So yeah, I mean, it did. There was a lot at stake for me emotionally in that.
How did you feel when you got the call from Oprah? Because I saw you on the morning show. I know this isn't a high literary question, but I need to ask it because you were so charming on the morning show with Gayle King and Oprah. And you mentioned that you did not think it was a fake phone call. When you got the call, somehow you believed it was her voice on the other end.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I didn't, I just told the truth on the program. That, I have one of these old phones. I know I should get a modern one, but it's wrong. It's got everything's wrong with it. And I usually have it turned to silent, or just that it makes a sort of fuzzy sound. Often because I don't know quite how to do the other thing. I have to press a thing, and it's a sort of weaponized helplessness. And so I had the phone on that, but. At the publishing house at Scribner, they said to me something about phones. Could you answer the phone? But I thought that was strange because why would they say that? And then I also knew that the book was coming out, in a week or two, and so the phone rang, and I honestly just thought, I'm in the middle of something else, and then it rang again, and then I didn't. And I looked at it, it was caller ID, but I thought, someone's trying to sell me life insurance, and the way it's hard to say, look, I can't talk to you now, as though there's some emergency, the washing machine has, blown up or something. And so I just didn't answer, and then it rang quite soon again. I thought, it's very curious. And so I went to it and pressed the thing you press. And somebody said, this is Oprah Winfrey. And there was no doubt in my mind that it was Oprah Winfrey. I don't know why this should be, because surely, if they, this is God Almighty, No, but seriously, in other words, if someone said this is, this is Joe Biden, I would have thought, no, it's a recorded voice. It's Joe Biden. It's a fundraiser for the Democrats for the election. They do that. They say, hi, this is Joe Biden. I've been wanting to call you for a while. And you'd know, I know what that is. That's the Democrats who are fundraising. And, it's nice because, so they should. And, but this wasn't like that. Whatever way it was, she said it, I realized immediately, Oprah is going to do my book. Now, if it had been, say, the Testament of Mary, about the Virgin Mary, or the book about Thomas Mann, I would have thought, Oprah's not going to do those books. But with this one, I thought that, in other words, that it's possible there are things in this that might interest her, and which I wouldn't have thought about the novel, like other novels I've written. And, but the only thing I could do, maybe it's an Irish thing and it's horrible, is to do a self-deprecating joke just to see if you could bring the temperature down a bit. Instead of saying, look, I can't believe it, or, I just said to her, because it was the day of the solar eclipse, and I said, oh, are you calling me about the eclipse? And honestly, it was just an effort to make a joke. I mean, I didn't think for a moment she was calling me about the eclipse, but it was an effort to just say something dry that would just diffuse, like, what should I say? You see, what should you say? You should say, well, I can't, but I did believe, you see, so I couldn't say I can't believe. And she was waiting for me to say something, and I said this, and then we had a very normal conversation. She was really nice about the book, and she had various things to say. It was lovely to talk to her, and I sort of realized, I never for a moment thought, this is not happening. And I often think that, sometimes I'm walking down Riverside Drive, and it's a beautiful day, and Columbia University isn't protesting yet. I think, this is, like, I'm 69 years old, I should be retired. Like, this isn't happening. That with Ordinary Day, but I didn't feel that then. Isn't that curious? Because surely you should say, like, touch yourself, or are you joking? But I didn't do any of that. I still can't understand that. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you. Thank you.